What if I told you that there is a God who looks for the people everyone else ignores? The kind of God who tracks your footsteps when you are running away from a life that has broken your heart. The kind of God who counts your tears when you feel completely invisible to the rest of the world. We love stories about heroes, don't we? We love stories about great kings, brave warriors, and famous leaders who do amazing things. But today, we are going to look behind the curtain of a very famous family. We are going to step away from the flashing lights of the main characters and look into the dark corner of a tent where a young woman is weeping in secret. This isn't a story about a person who chose her own destiny. This is a story about someone who was caught up in someone else's plan, someone who was used like an object, thrown away like trash, and left to die in a burning, empty wasteland. This is the true biblical story of Hagar. It is a story about unfairness, deep hurt, and a lonely desert. But more than anything, it is the story of a God who sees the forgotten, a God who listens to the cries of the outcasts, and a God who shows up when all hope is completely gone. To really understand Hagar's life, we have to travel back in time, thousands of years ago, to a land filled with dusty roads, heavy stone altars, and traveling tents. We have to look at a very famous couple named Abram and Sarai. You might know them better by the names God gave them later, Abraham and Sarah. God had made a massive, beautiful promise to Abram. He told him that he would become the father of a huge nation and that his children would be as numerous as the stars in the midnight sky. It sounded wonderful. It sounded miraculous. But there was just one giant, heartbreaking problem. Abram and Sarai were getting very, very old, and they didn't have any children at all. Now, during this long time of waiting, a terrible famine hit the land. There was no food anywhere. The dirt was dry, the crops died, and the stomachs of the people were completely empty. So Abram took his whole household and traveled down to the wealthy land of Egypt to find food. While they were in Egypt, some messy things happened. Abram got scared that the Egyptians would kill him to take his beautiful wife, so he told a lie and said Sarai was just his sister. Pharaoh, the powerful king of Egypt, took Sarai into his palace and gave Abram gifts to show his appreciation, gifts like sheep, cattle, donkeys, and human servants. And that, my friends, is exactly where Hagar enters the picture. Hagar was a young Egyptian girl. We don't know who her mother or father were. We don't know what her dreams were before this moment. But suddenly, because of a king's gift, her entire life was flipped upside down. She was taken away from her homeland, away from the wide Nile River, away from everything she had ever known. And she became a servant. She became property. She had to pack up her few belongings and walk behind the camels of this strange foreign couple traveling back into the land of Canaan. Imagine how lonely that must have been for a young girl, to live in a camp where everyone speaks a different language, worships a different God, and looks at you like you were just a tool to get work done. For years, Hagar lived in the shadows of Sarai's tent. She washed the clothes, she prepared the food, and she watched her mistress. And what she saw was a mistress who was growing more bitter and sad by the day. 10 years passed after Abram and Sarai returned to the land of Canaan. 10 long, silent years. Every single night, Sarai would walk outside her tent, look up at the glittering stars, and remember God's promise. And every single morning, she would wake up to the painful reality that she was still barren. No baby cries filled the camp. The cradles remained completely empty. The silence in the tent grew louder and louder until it felt like a heavy weight that Sarai could no longer carry. Finally, Sarai snapped. She decided that God was taking too long and she needed to take matters into her own hands. She cooked up a human plan to fix a divine problem. One afternoon, Sarai called Hagar into her tent. Hagar probably bowed, waiting to be told to fetch water or grind grain. The Sarai looked at her husband Abram and said something that must have made Hagar's heart stop. She said, "The Lord has kept me from having children. Go, sleep with my servant Hagar. Perhaps I can build a family through her." Now, to a 10-year-old child listening today, this sounds completely crazy and wrong. And it was wrong. But back in those ancient times, people had a custom. If a wife couldn't have a baby, she could give her servant girl to her husband. If the servant had a baby, that baby would legally belong to the mistress. It was like treating a human being like a machine. Nobody asked Hagar what she wanted. Nobody asked if she was ready to become a mother or if she wanted to be married to Abram. She had no say in the matter. She was handed over to Abram and she became pregnant. At first, Hagar must have felt a strange rush of emotions. For the first time in her entire life, she wasn't just an invisible servant girl in the background. She was carrying the child of the great leader Abram. She had something that the wealthy, powerful mistress Sarai would give all her silver and gold to have. And that is when the atmosphere in the camp turned completely toxic. The Bible tells us that when Hagar knew she was pregnant, she began to look at her mistress Sarai with contempt. She probably held her head a little higher. She probably walked past Sarai with a proud look on her face, thinking, "Look at me, I did what you could never do." It's easy to understand why Hagar felt that way, right? When you've been pushed down your whole life, the moment you get a little bit of power, it's hard not to use it. But Sarai was absolutely furious. The jealousy boiled up inside her heart like a volcano. She went running to Abram, yelling, "This is all your fault. I put my servant in your arms, and now that she is pregnant, she despises me. May the Lord judge between you and me." Abram didn't want to get caught in the middle of a massive fight between his wife and his servant. He shrunk back and said to Sarai, "Your servant is in your hands. Do with her whatever you think is best." Wow. Think about how cold that was. Abram didn't protect Hagar. He didn't protect the tiny baby growing inside her. He just washed his hands of the whole situation. With Abram stepping out of the way, Sarai began to treat Hagar terribly. The Bible says Sarai mistreated her. This wasn't just giving her extra chores. It was harsh, cruel, and painful treatment. It was designed to break Hagar's spirit and remind her that she was nothing but a slave. Day after day, the abuse continued until Hagar couldn't take it for one more second. She decided to do something incredibly dangerous. She decided to run. One dark night, while the whole camp was fast asleep, Hagar slipped out of the tent. She didn't have a map, she didn't have a camel, she didn't have a weapon to protect herself from wild animals or bandits. All she had was the heavy clothes on her back and a heart full of absolute terror and desperation. She ran out into the wilderness, heading south, trying to find her way back home to Egypt. Imagine a pregnant young woman walking all alone through the rocky, burning desert. The sun during the day was like a furnace, scorching her skin. The wind at night was freezing cold, making her shiver in the dark. Her feet were bleeding from the sharp stones. Her throat felt like sandpaper. Eventually, her legs gave out and she collapsed next to a small spring of water in the desert, right along the road to a place called Shur. She sat there, burying her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably. She was trapped between a cruel past and an impossible future. She couldn't go back to the abuse of Sarai, and she couldn't survive the long, empty road to Egypt. She was completely, totally alone. Or so she thought. Suddenly, a voice broke through the silence of the wasteland. But it wasn't the voice of a bandit or a wild beast. It was a voice filled with authority and kindness that Hagar had never heard before in her entire life. The angel of the Lord found her right there by the water spring. And listen to the very first thing he said to her. He didn't just say, "Hey, you." He called out, "Hagar, servant of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going?" Oh my goodness, stop and think about that for a moment. The creator of the universe sent his messenger into the middle of a trackless desert to find one lonely runaway slave girl, and he called her by her actual name. In Abram's camp, she was just the servant, but to God, she was Hagar. He knew exactly who she belonged to, he knew exactly what she had been through, and he knew the heavy pain hiding inside her broken heart. Hagar looked up, trembling with fear, and answered honestly, "I'm running away from my mistress Sarai." The angel of the Lord looked at her with eyes full of deep compassion, but the instructions he gave her next must have been so incredibly hard to hear. He told her, "Go back to your mistress and submit to her." Why would God tell her to go back to a place of hurt? Because God knew that a pregnant woman alone in the ancient desert would die. He was protecting her life and the life of her unborn child. But God didn't just send her back empty-handed. He gave her a massive, beautiful promise of her very own. The angel told her, "I will increase your descendants so much that they will be too numerous to count." And then he told her about the baby in her womb. "You are now pregnant, and you will give birth to a son. You shall name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard your misery." Do you know what the name Ishmael means in Hebrew? It means God hears. Every single time Hagar would look at her little boy, every single time she called out his name across the tents, she would be reminded of the beautiful truth that God is not deaf to our pain. He hears us when we cry in the dark. Hagar was so overwhelmed with the love and the presence of God that she did something completely unprecedented. In the ancient world, usually the men, the great patriarchs, gave names to places or altars, but this young Egyptian servant girl gave a name to the living God. She called the Lord who spoke to her El Roi. In our language, that means, "You are the God who sees me." She said to herself in wonder, "I have now seen the one who sees me." The spring of water where this happened was named Beer Lahai Roi, which means the well of the living one who sees me.
Before we continue Hagar's incredible journey, if her story reminds you that God still sees the forgotten, you will love my book, Becoming a Modern Proverbs 31 Woman. It's a practical biblical guide to growing in faith, character, and purpose. Simply scan the QR code on your screen or check the pinned comment to get your copy. Also, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more inspiring Bible stories. Now, let's return to Hagar's story.
With a completely transformed heart, Hagar stood up from that desert spring. She wasn't just a hopeless slave anymore. She was a woman who had met the living God. She walked all the way back to the camp of Abram and Sarai. She submitted to her mistress, and when the time came, she gave birth to a beautiful baby boy. Abram was 86 years old when Ishmael was born, and he loved his son dearly. For 14 years, there was a season of relative peace in the camp. 14 years of watching little Ishmael run around the tents, laughing, playing, and growing into a strong, wild young boy. Hagar raised him with the knowledge that his name meant God hears. But then, everything changed all over again. When Abram was 99 years old, God appeared to him and reminded him that the promise of a chosen nation would come specifically through a child born to Sarai, whose name was now changed to Sarah. And miraculously, against all human odds, 90-year-old Sarah became pregnant and gave birth to a son named Isaac. The camp exploded with joy. Everyone was laughing and celebrating. But as Isaac grew and reached the age where he was finally weaned from his mother's milk, a huge celebration feast was held. And during that party, the old, buried tension between the two mothers flared up with a terrifying intensity. Sarah was watching the children play. Suddenly, she looked over and saw 14-year-old Ishmael mocking or laughing at little Isaac. To Sarah, this wasn't just a normal childhood argument. This was a direct threat to her own son's future inheritance. All the old jealousy, all the old hatred, and all the old bitterness came rushing back into her heart like a roaring flood. She turned around, found Abram, and demanded with ice in her voice, "Get rid of that slave woman and her son, for that woman's son will never share in the inheritance with my son Isaac." Abram's heart shattered into a million pieces. The Bible tells us that this matter distressed Abram greatly because Ishmael was his son too. He loved Ishmael with all his heart. How could he cast his own flesh and blood out into the wilderness? He tossed and turned all night, unable to sleep, torn between his wife's furious demands and his love for his boy. But that night, God spoke to Abram. God told him, "Do not be distressed about the boy and your slave woman. Listen to whatever Sarah tells you, because it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned." But then God added a promise of comfort for Abram's bleeding heart. "I will make the son of the servant into a nation also, because he is your offspring." Early the very next morning, before the sun had even fully climbed over the horizon, Abram woke up Hagar and Ishmael. The camp was deadly quiet. Abraham didn't give them a caravan of camels or a bag of gold or a guard to protect them. The Bible tells us he took some food and a single skin of water, strapped them onto Hagar's shoulders, kissed his son goodbye, and sent them away. Can you imagine the absolute betrayal Hagar must have felt? 14 years ago, she had come back because God told her to. She had been faithful. She had done everything right. She had watched her son grow up as a prince of the household. And now, because a new baby had arrived, she and her teenage boy were being evicted, thrown out into the wilderness like garbage, with nothing but a single loaf of bread and a leather bag of water. Hagar took Ishmael by the hand, and they walked away from the only home they had ever known, wandering aimlessly into the scorching, brutal desert of Beersheba. The hours dragged on like days. The desert sun rose high into the sky, beating down on them like a hammer. The heat waves shimmered over the burning sand. Every step they took felt like walking through hot coals. Ishmael, being a growing boy, needed water constantly. Hagar watched with growing panic as the leather water skin grew lighter and lighter, until finally it was completely bone dry. Not a single drop was left. There were no rivers in Beersheba. There were no lakes. There were no towns. There was nothing but endless miles of dust, thorns, and rocks. Ishmael's strength completely failed. His throat closed up, his lips cracked and bled, and his body grew limp from dehydration. He couldn't walk another step. Hagar realized with a horrifying shock that her precious boy was about to die a slow, agonizing death right before her eyes. The despair was too much for a mother's heart to bear. She dragged Ishmael over to a small desert bush and pushed him under the shade of its dry branches to shield him from the killer sun. Then she walked away about the distance of a bow shot, far enough so she wouldn't have to see him suffer. She sat down on the hard, dusty ground, buried her face in her hands, and began to scream and cry out in absolute agony. She cried out, "I cannot watch my boy die." Listen to the sheer heartbreak in that sentence. Hagar had survived being a slave. She had survived the abuse of Sarai. She had survived running away the first time. But watching her child die was a pain that completely broke her. She wept until she had no tears left to cry. The desert wind carried the sound of a mother's broken heart across the empty dunes. But Hagar didn't know something. She forgot about the name of her son. She forgot that 14 years earlier, a promise had been made. The Bible tells us something incredibly beautiful in Genesis chapter 21. It says, God heard the boy crying. Think about that. Hagar was the one screaming and weeping out loud, but God's ears were tuned to the soft, weak cries of the dying boy under the bush. God remembered the name Ishmael. God hears. Suddenly, for the second time in Hagar's life, the voice of the angel of God called to her from heaven. The voice shattered the heavy silence of her despair. "What is the matter, Hagar?" the angel asked. "Do not be afraid. God has heard the boy crying as he lies there. Lift the boy up and take him by the hand, for I will make him into a great nation." Then, right there in the middle of the hopeless wasteland, God did a miracle. The Bible says that God opened her eyes, and she saw something that hadn't been there before. She saw a well of water. It wasn't a mirage. It wasn't a trick of the mind. It was a real, bubbling spring of cool, life-giving water hidden right there in the desert. Hagar scrambled to her feet, ran to the well, and filled the leather skin to the brim. She ran back to the bush, lifted her son's head, and poured the cool water down his parched throat. Can you imagine the pure joy and relief washing over her face as she watched the color return to her son's cheeks? Can you imagine the tears of gratitude mixing with the dust on her skin? The God who sees became the God who saves. The Bible tells us that God was with the boy as he grew up. Ishmael didn't die in that wasteland. He lived in the desert of Paran, became an expert archer, and his mother Hagar found a wife for him from her own homeland of Egypt. Ishmael went on to have 12 sons who became 12 powerful tribal leaders, fulfilling the massive promise that God had given to Hagar by the well. The story of Hagar is an ancient one, but it is a story that speaks directly to our modern lives today. We live in a world that is so much like the camp of Abraham and Sarai. It is a world filled with people who are striving, planning, and using other people to get what they want. We live in a world where people are constantly being pushed into the shadows, used for their talents, and then thrown away when they are no longer needed or convenient. Maybe you have felt like Hagar before. Maybe you have felt the burning pain of being rejected by people who were supposed to love you. Maybe you have been caught up in a bad situation that you didn't choose, and you feel like you are wandering through a lonely, dry desert of depression, anxiety, or heartbreak right now. You look at your life and you think, the water has run out. There is no hope left for me. Nobody cares if I live or die. But Hagar's life stands as a massive, shining lighthouse of hope across the centuries. Her story reminds us that God does not just belong to the famous, the powerful, or the people who seem to have it all together. God belongs to the runner. God belongs to the slave. God belongs to the single mother weeping in the desert over her children. God is El Roi, the God who sees you in your darkest moment when everyone else has turned their backs and walked away. When Hagar was at her lowest point, ready to give up and die, God didn't look at her with judgment. He didn't lecture her. He opened her eyes to see a well of water that was already there. And 2,000 years after Hagar found that well in the desert, another person would sit down by a well in Samaria and meet another outcast woman. That person was Jesus Christ, and he promised that anyone who drinks the water he gives will never thirst again, because it becomes a spring of water welling up to eternal life. Whatever desert you are standing in right now, whatever trouble or wreckage you are facing, the God who sees and the God who hears is standing right next to you. He is not blind to your pain. He is opening your eyes today to see His love, His grace, and His provision. Will you let Him take you by the hand? Will you trust the one who tracks your footsteps in the wilderness? The well of life is open, and it has always been open. Thank you so much for spending this time with me exploring the beautiful and powerful life of Hagar. If this story encouraged your heart, I'd love to hear from you. So leave a comment below and tell me what spoke to you most. And if you're a woman who desires to grow closer to God and live out God's purpose with confidence, I invite you to read my book, Becoming a Modern Proverbs 31 Woman. It is a practical, biblical guide to developing godly character, strengthening your faith, and embracing the woman God created you to be. Simply scan the QR code on your screen or check the pinned comment to get your copy today. Also, let me know which Bible story you'd like to see next. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video with someone who needs the reminder that God sees them.